We've got this wonderful presentation coming up right now with Dr. Casey Taft, our guest of honor. Dr. Casey Taft is a professor of psychiatry at Boston University School of Medicine. He is an internationally recognized researcher in the area of violence prevention and winner of 7 prestigious awards for his work. And I'm not going to list them all for you, it might take a little while, but they're amazing. He has consulted with the United Nations on preventing violence and abuse globally and has published over 100 journal articles, book chapters, yes, and scientific reports. Dr. Taft is the author of Motivational Methods for Vegan Advocacy, a clinical psychology perspective, and the American Psychological Association book, Trauma-Informed Treatment and Prevention of Intimate Partner Violence. Yes. He is also co-owner of Vegan Publishers, a vegan-themed publishing company. We're so lucky to have him with us tonight. He's going to be speaking on navigating relationships, wellness, and everyday life as an animal advocate. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks again to Shauna for being such a great host, and thank you for the students who made it out here on spring break. You're awesome for coming. I really appreciate that. So what I'm going to talk about is my new book, and actually I'll be selling the very first copies of the book tonight. I love it. I love the energy in here. So it's called Millennial Vegan, Tips for Navigating Relationships, Wellness, and Everyday Life as a Young Animal Advocate. The book really talks about how to navigate, these kind of murky waters of dealing with friends and family members who aren't vegan when we're vegan. And I, as the owner of Vegan Publishers, I manage our social media pages, our Facebook page, and I get emails almost every day from younger vegans who describe difficulties they're having with friends or families and in their relationships, dealing with anger, dealing with their own anger and frustration. And as a psychologist, I sort of felt compelled to try to put something out there to help support young vegans. So my book is about, is specifically geared for younger vegans, although I think what I'll be talking about tonight is not just relevant for younger people. I mean, I as, a 44-year-old man, deal with these very same issues of struggling to talk with friends or family members, dealing with my own anger and frustration, and all these other things. So this is not something that only affects young people, but I definitely geared it towards young people because I really wanted to put something out there to help support these folks. And a lot of the people who message me is really kind of heartbreaking stories where they're, vegan teenagers and they're getting bullied by peers. Their parents are literally forcing them to eat animals, and they're, depressed and suicidal, all kinds of problems that, young people deal with. So anything that I can do to kind of help that is what I wanted to do. Another reason I wrote the book is because, young vegans are awesome. You totally are. It really blows me away. For most of us really didn't go vegan until later in life. And when I'm talking about millennials, I'm talking about between the age of 15 and 34. There was a recent survey done by, I think it was the Vegan Society, and they found that 42% of all vegans are millennials. They're in that age range between 15 and 34. So younger people are going vegan at a much higher rate than everybody else. And you're doing this at a time where you're literally being screwed over in a lot of ways in our society. Let's be honest. So more millennials have college degrees than any prior generation, and yet they carry the highest debt and unemployment. So in a lot of ways, millennials kind of bear the burden of poor decisions prior generations have made, or poor votes that they've made, and our elected officials aren't really looking out for younger people. So even despite all the stressors you're dealing with, you see past all of the indoctrination that you go through at a young age and have gone vegan. And to me, that really blows me away, because for many of us, it took us a lot longer to get past that indoctrination and to really see kind of the truth behind all of the socialization that we've received to do harm to non-human animals. So I am in awe of you and want to support you. But as I'll be talking about, this greater awareness also comes at a great cost and often a great social cost. So we're going to talk about these issues and how we're going to deal with them. So let's talk about loneliness. It's lonely being vegan. And I've enlisted the support of volunteers around the room who've agreed to read quotes. And these are all quotes that were taken directly from emails that have been sent to me or messages on social media message boards that young vegans have said. So let's see the first one. Who's got this one?
When I posted on our Facebook page that zoos are unethical prisons for animals, my mother commented, "Without zoos, how would children develop an appreciation for all these different animals?" This was just after we had a family vacation. I had to watch them all eat animal corpses for every meal the entire week. How's that for animal appreciation? For the first time, I really became aware and went vegan. I'm feeling completely hopeless and alone. I have over 1,000 Facebook friends who are vegan, and I get a handful of likes for my vegan posts, but I also get negative comments. I could really use some vegan support right now to help me get past this lonely feeling today.
Thank you. Leave this here. Can any of you relate to, whether you're a young vegan or an older vegan? Raise your hand if you can relate to that sentiment. So a lot of you can relate to this. The idea of kind of witnessing people contributing to harm to non-human animals all around us and feeling like we're the only people in the world who are aware and kind of paying attention and trying to minimize the harm we do. It's not easy, especially for younger vegans. And it's helpful to think about why that might be. Why do people react in all different kinds of ways? Responses to friends or family members or others to vegans may range from mild discomfort to more abusive behavior. We get all different kinds of reactions from other people, and oftentimes this is because that just by the mere fact that we're vegans, just the presence of a vegan in the room can make other people uncomfortable. How many of you have told somebody you were vegan and the other person got really defensive and started saying well, I don't eat that much meat, or I only eat humanely killed animals, right? Right. So just our mere presence as vegans can elicit these shame responses, and unfortunately those closest to us are not immune from this, and they may still have this feeling of guilt and shame, which can impact our relationships with them, unfortunately. Our greater awareness may conflict with family values and traditions and practices, and can really which can really contribute to a lot of conflict that we may have with loved ones. It's also really difficult, as a vegan, to witness those that we love and care about knowingly do harm to non-human animals. I mean, with all the information that's out there, and with us, a living example of a vegan who's certainly willing to talk to them about everything, and a lot of you are we are ready, we're definitely ready to talk to our family about it, but yet they still decide to, at some level, kind of shut off awareness and not really listen to the vegan message. This can be frustrating for us, especially because we know our family members and loved ones as otherwise kind and caring and compassionate people, and we know if they would just let in the message, they would resonate with it and they would join us. But that often doesn't happen, and that's really difficult for us, and it can't help but affect our relationships in some way, and we can't help but feel at least some sense of disappointment in family members. We can work to overcome this and still maintain good relationships with our family, still learn to accept them, but this is bound to affect our sense of loneliness, our feeling of disconnectedness from other people. And we may feel rejected and disconnected. I know for a lot of folks where they feel like that, over the years you could tell your family members or your friends anything and, have conversations about how you're growing and changing, and maybe your experiences that your family members are really kind of interested in and invested in learning and understanding what's going on with you. But here we have an issue where we can't really talk to our family about it in a productive way, and they don't really seem interested in knowing how we're growing and changing. So this is really difficult and can be alienating for some people. So in the book and in this talk, I don't want to just talk about the problems, and how like everybody else sucks, right? I mean, we also should talk a little bit about like, what do we do about it? How can we combat loneliness? How can we improve this situation? First and foremost, I think it's really incumbent on all of us and really important for us to not keep in our feelings. As a psychologist, so I should have mentioned this at the beginning, but yeah, I'm a clinical psychologist who works specifically in the area of helping families improve communication in particular. And the more that we keep in our feelings, the more we stuff our feelings, stuff our anger, stuff our frustration, things are just going to continue to get worse and worse. So you don't resolve anything by keeping everything in. So we have to express our feelings to our loved ones, even if it may be a little bit uncomfortable. I also think it's really helpful to view others as pre-vegans. I view everybody as a pre-vegan if they're not a vegan. And the reason for that is because I believe that everybody has the capacity to change if they really let the information in, if they develop awareness. And for me, it's really helpful, and I feel a little bit less alienated from other people if I maintain that hopeful perspective that they're not there yet, but they will get there. And almost all of us weren't vegan our whole lives either. And almost all of us were at the same place that they were at some point. So just reminding ourselves of that, reminding ourselves that they're not there yet, but they're gonna get there, can be really helpful, rather than kind of developing the perspective that all non-vegans are terrible people and the world's a terrible place. Because that's gonna really make you feel more lonely. Right, so yeah, so the question is, like, if family or friends overreact, you think it's because they feel like we're disapproving? And I absolutely think so. I think it's that kind of shame response that just by trying to talk about our own experience of going vegan, it reminds people that they have not yet done that. And they feel like they need to kind of explain themselves, or they need to kind of try to shut you down in some way, right? So I think that's really where it comes from. And I think it's important for us to not let anybody else shut us down, right? So because that's what a lot of people love. They love it if all of us vegans just shut up, right? But I think we're not doing the animals any favors by silencing ourselves, and we're also not helping our relationships if we're not openly talking about how we feel. So viewing others as pre-vegans is important. We need to balance acceptance and change. So with my family members, I still accept and love them, even though not all of them have gone vegan. And yet I still do talk about veganism. I still try to help promote change, but I make it really clear that I love you, I still love you regardless, and I still accept you. But this is something that's really important to me. This is something that's very difficult for me. So I think it's important, if we want to maintain relationships with other people, to still convey that we still accept them in our lives. At the same time, I never convey that it's okay to kill animals or to use animals or anything like that. So I'm really clear about how I feel about it, but at the same time I make it clear that I'm not rejecting them and I'm not kind of banishing them from my life. Also, I think it helps when we stick to, we should feel proud for sticking to our convictions. So that is something that helps us to manage this sense of loneliness, just the feeling that we're doing what we think is right, and we're sticking to our convictions, we're doing what we think is important. So that can help, I think, kind of lessen those feelings of loneliness or sadness we may be experiencing. And I think all of us, this meeting is a good example. We create our own social world. So we can create our own community with other like-minded people who share our values and share our views. So I think meetings like this are so important to combat our own feelings of loneliness and social isolation. Whether it's in person or whether it's online, I think it's really important to build these kinds of communities. And lastly, and this is something that I've learned as a psychologist, but I also learned this personally in my own life, that helping other people feels good. And probably one of the best treatments of depression, one of the best ways to deal with loneliness, to deal with sadness, is to do something where you feel like you're doing good for others. So that's something that I definitely experienced when I was going through a difficult time when I was in grad school. I was doing a practicum at a psychiatric hospital, and I poured everything into my patients. And ultimately that is how I got out of my own depression, is just pouring everything into them and seeing the reaction that they were having really helped me get out of it. And a lot of my patients describe a very similar thing. The more that we do for other people, the more sense of satisfaction, the more sense of meaning that we find in our life that really helps us deal with sadness and loneliness. Okay, so next I want to talk about the importance of assertiveness. I think we have another quote coming up here.
I just had a very difficult discussion with someone who came up with every excuse in their book for killing and eating animals. Some people are just too uncomfortable with the idea of change that they won't even listen to facts that we lay out for them. So I refused to let his childish comments with no logic upset me, and I maintained my good intentions to speak calmly but clearly about veganism. I've learned so much about veganism recently that I felt like I could deal with all of his rationalizations in a non-confrontational way. And for once, the conversation didn't turn into an argument, and I feel like he was actually listening in the end. I have found that the more calm and genuine I am, the better I'm able to reach others.
Thank you. So if there was one kind of skill I could convey to every vegan on the planet, it would be assertiveness. And I think that scenario, that quote that was just read, is a good example of that. That the more kind of calm and clear and rational we can be when talking about veganism, when talking to friends, family members, and loved ones, the more effective we're going to be not only in advocating for animals, but also in kind of improving relationships, in communicating how we feel to other people. So this is basically communication skills 101, is to find a way to be assertive without being overly passive or overly aggressive. So to be overly passive means that you're holding everything in, you're keeping in your feelings, and what happens when you stuff your feelings and you just stuff and stuff your feelings? What happens then? Yeah, you explode, right? The more you keep it in, eventually it kind of boils over, and that's when you get into an argument. Or you go to the other extreme and respond to people aggressively by name calling or attacking other people, and we know that doesn't work. So why doesn't responding aggressively to other people work? What's that? Yeah, they won't listen to you. When you start to get aggressive with other people, they will assume that you're just not being rational right then, and they're going to try to get away from you, basically. So to be assertive means to find that middle ground between being passive or aggressive, and that is really what I teach all my clients in terms of how to communicate better with others. Let's see. So when we're assertive with other people, we're not only being respectful of other people, but we're also being respectful of ourselves because we're not keeping in our feelings. And assertiveness doesn't necessarily mean agreeing with other people. Some people mistake being assertive with just being super polite and going along with other people, what other people say. And that's not what assertiveness is. Assertiveness is really being clear, and sometimes it may mean setting really kind of firm limits on other people and what you find is acceptable. Like, so for example, if somebody's bullying you or somebody's kind of saying hurtful things to you, an assertive response could be that, if you're going to continue to do this, then I'm going to end this discussion, or I'm not going to talk to you anymore, or I'm not going to do this social event with you anymore if this continues. So assertiveness can mean setting really firm limits on others. Another example of kind of assertive communication for some people may be, they feel like it's too upsetting for them to dine with others when they're consuming animals. So that's another form of limit setting that some people do, that they let others know that if you're going to be eating an animal, then I'm not going to be dining with you because it's too upsetting for me. I feel like it hurts our relationship when I see you eating animals. It really kind of disappoints me, and I get frustrated and angry, and it affects our relationship. So that's just another example. For some people, that may be a limit that they want to set or a way to be assertive. But no two people are alike, and the limits that we set are individual for us. So we want to establish boundaries and limits. When we're assertive, it allows for greater understanding and improve relationships and advocacy. One tip for being assertive and giving assertive messages is to use what are known as I statements. Have any of you heard of I statements before? Okay, right. So I statements, that's also kind of basic communication skills that we as psychologists talk about a lot. And the idea is that it's always best to focus on yourself. And rather saying, you need to do this or you need to do that, we tell our own stories and we say, I feel this way or I feel that way. So when we're simply telling our own stories and kind of speaking our own truth, it's a lot harder for the other person to have that shame response or to get defensive and get hostile. We're just talking about how we feel, right? So that should be less likely to elicit that kind of negative response from other people. So I think as much as we can, we should be using I statements and telling our own story rather than saying you should be doing this and you should be doing that. Any questions about this or comments? Okay. Just some other assertive communication tips. I think it's really important for all of us to kind of educate ourselves about veganism. I know when I first went vegan, I had my discussions with loved ones were a lot more difficult, and I would often get into arguments with folks just because I didn't have all the information kind of at my fingertips. I didn't know how to respond to the common myths that we hear about our use of animals, and I would just get frustrated and tongue-tied, and the conversations often didn't go very well. So I think it's really important that we're all kind of aware of, we all learn as much as we can and think of ways to respond to the common myths that we hear. So what are some of those myths? What are some of those myths that others will throw at us about our use of animals? Yes?
If we all eat plants, there won't be enough plants on the planet for us to eat.
So we're going to eat all the plants on the planet? Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, yes?
Or if we don't eat all the animals, they'll take us over.
Right, yeah, right. It's seemingly, people don't realize that they're bred to be killed and eaten. Yes? Where do you get your protein? Right, that's a big one. Any other ones? Right, so like one is that vegans are weak. Another is that we need to eat animals to be healthy. There's this belief that there's some what I've heard referred to as vitamin meat. There's a special vitamin in meat that you can only get in meat, which doesn't really exist. So yeah, that's another big one. And there are responses to all these, and it's funny to talk about, but these are myths that people actually believe, right? So we have to be ready with responses to them, and it's not always easy to respond to them. And sometimes we may assume that the person is just trying to upset us by throwing all these things out. But these are real beliefs that people have, so we should have responses ready for them. Recognize your triggers. So this is anger management 101. Think about what are the issues that are especially difficult for you, and when you're aware of that and you're ready for it, when it comes up, you'll be better able to deal with it, and maybe you'll have to take a break for a little while. Like for example, for some people, when a non-vegan will say, well, what about plants? You're killing plants. Right, like that's a hot, that's a trigger for a lot of people. Like I like to call them plants rights activists. People who are really fighting for plants, without really realizing that non-vegans kill more plants and animals because they have to feed the animals with the plants their whole lives. So that it's just good to be aware of what are the triggers for you, and just be mindful of that and be ready to kind of take a break when you need to. Show that you're listening, and this is really important. Really, the first thing that I teach about communication when I'm working with a patient, trying to help them communicate better, is to practice listening to other people and showing other people that you're listening to what they have to say. Even if you're not agreeing with them, and there's different ways of doing that. You can paraphrase what they say. That's kind of a good active listening skill, where you're repeating back what they say to you, but using slightly different words to show that you understand the meaning of what they said. You can ask open-ended questions. You can validate the other person, say, I can understand why you feel that way, even though that you might have a difference of opinion and you disagree with what they're saying. The more that you show other people you're listening, the more likely it is that they're going to listen to what you have to say. So, and how many of you have gotten into a discussion where each one of you is trying to get your point across the other person, but neither person is listening to what the other person has to say? That happens a lot, and that is, and that's a big problem because neither person hears what the other person is saying. So, others aren't going to hear about how we feel if we don't at least show that we're listening to what they're saying to us. It's also important to learn when to end a discussion. So, there are plenty of times where, we just have to tell ourselves, okay, this is not productive. This isn't going anywhere. This isn't helping. We're not going to, go anywhere good from here. So this is a good time for us to take a break and end the discussion. So that's something else that happens a lot, especially with new vegans, is they end up arguing like for hours about like an issue, like maybe one of these myths, or maybe, for example, about like early humans and what was their diet and how we're biologically adapted to eat animals or not. I know I've gotten into a lot of debates and discussions about those kinds of things that didn't really go anywhere. So it's helpful to learn when to end the discussion and decide, okay, maybe we'll talk about this some other time, but it's not really very productive right now. Also understand that we can't force change. And this is something that may be difficult for some of us to accept because we so badly want everybody to go vegan. We so badly want a vegan world. And especially our loved ones, those who we really care about and we know as I said earlier, kind and compassionate people, we really want to be able to connect with them about this and for them to kind of, see that the harm that we're doing, not only to animals, but also the planet. But at some point we have to recognize that we've kind of said or done everything we could say or do, and that we're going to have to just accept the fact that we're not going to force this person to change. We're not going to be able to make them change if they're not ready to do it. I recently, this past week, my wife and I learned that my father-in-law decided to switch to a plant-based diet, and we're like super excited about it, yeah. But what's funny about it was we almost never talked to him about it. We almost never, talked to him about veganism. But he was paying attention to what we were saying and what we were doing, and he knew everything. But at some point he just kind of decided it was time, and and he resonated with the harm we do to animals and the health aspects of it, and he went plant-based. And he told us, others actually asked him, what made you change? And he said that the way my wife and I were non-judgmental, and we presented the information and talked about things in a straightforward and clear way, and didn't try to force him to change, that's what really helped. He said that if they tried to make me change, if they had gotten aggressive, there's no way I would have changed. So, and I know it's difficult. I know it's hard when you so badly want people to change, and you really want to see that change. But at some point, we have to realize that there's only so much we can say and do, and they know where we are. They know how to find us. If they're ever ready to talk about it, we could talk to them about it. But it's not going to do us any good to try to jam it down their throat. I hear people get into like debates about like how best to promote veganism. Should we just live by example, or should we actively speak out for non-human animals? I believe we should speak out for animals as much as we can, but at some point it doesn't get us anywhere, and at some point it becomes counterproductive. So, and for some people, yeah, just by watching us, and they know we're vegan, and we're ready to talk to them about it whenever they're ready to talk about it, that can be what helps them make that decision to change. It really helps to know what stage somebody is in terms of their readiness. So if somebody is, we call it they're in the pre-contemplation stage of change, where they're not really even thinking about changing, that's where planting seeds can be really helpful, because you know that they're not going to go vegan, for every conversation you have with them, right? That you're not just going to turn people vegan by talking to them about it, but you may be planting a seed. For other people who are kind of closer, they're actually ready to hear kind of the ethical message, we may actually be the converter for those people, right? So it really depends on who you're talking to and what stage they're at. For some people, we're planting seeds. For some people, we're actually helping them make that change and decide to go vegan. So, for us as animal advocates, I think it's incumbent on us to figure out where is this person at right now in terms of their readiness and try to give them whatever they need to help them get to that next level. Some folks will think that they know the one message that will turn everybody vegan, right? They'll say, all you have to do is like show them great food, or all you have to do is this or that. But the truth is, if there was one message that worked for everybody, we'd all be giving that message and everybody would be vegan, right? So there's clearly not one message. We have to figure out who we're talking to, where they are in terms of their readiness, and what message might be most effective for them. But I'm getting more into advocacy than the other stuff. But what gets in the way of people going vegan? Because, like you said, there's all kinds of information out there. If anybody goes on, Facebook or the internet, it's all there. So why do people remain non-vegan? I think there's a few reasons for that. One is, I think, the guilt and shame that we've been talking about. The more that folks experience this kind of shame response, the more they shut down and shut others out. So they don't let in that. They don't let in the message. I think for other people, they are just kind of struggling to make it, day to day. A lot of people out there are just struggling with all kinds of issues, whether it's financial, whether it's, trauma or stress or mental health issues. I know for myself, I think my whole life, I've always kind of been vegan at heart. But I didn't fully make the change, and I think for part of that time, it was because I felt like I just had too many other issues I had to deal with. I just felt like I just didn't have my life together. I was just struggling in a lot of ways, and I felt like that was just too much for me to take on. And rightly or wrongly, obviously, knowing what I know now, we all probably wish that we went vegan sooner. But at the time, I just felt overwhelmed with things, and I just felt like I couldn't do it. I think a lot of people out there are struggling and dealing with all kinds of trauma and all kinds of other stuff, and that gets in the way for them. And I'm not saying that that's okay or that it justifies it, but it's helpful for us to be aware of that so we can, again, meet them where they're at and to acknowledge the difficulty they may be having while we're still kind of promoting veganism, right? Because when we just kind of dismiss people's struggles and say, oh, get over it, veganism is easy, then they feel invalidated and feel like we're not listening to them, and they'll be like, just screw them, I'm not going to listen to anything they have to say. I was working in the area of violence prevention for several years before I really made the connection between preventing violence towards humans and the violence we inflict on non-humans. And in fact, the conference I was just at is a violence conference. And often at these violence conferences I go to with all the leaders in preventing violence towards humans, it's hard to get a vegan meal at these events, right? So it's really sometimes shocking at how disconnected people are. People who want to prevent violence, people who care about preventing violence, but they still don't make that connection to the violence they're contributing to with every meal. So we've been socialized, and it's very powerful. Okay, so let's talk about dealing with abuse.
I really could use some advice. I'm getting so tired of getting so much abuse from other people when I speak up about veganism. I hate to say it, but some part of me wants to just be quiet about it, even though I know that doesn't help animals. It's so not so the harassment will stop. I want to make people aware of the suffering of the animals, regardless of the fact that I will be persecuted continuously for doing so. I feel like I'm at a crossroads and I don't really know what to do.
Thank you. Excellent reading. That was very good. Can any of you relate to that? Raise your hand if you can relate to any of that in any way. Have any of you experienced, and it doesn't necessarily have to be this form, but have any of you experienced even subtle bullying from other people about veganism? Right. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about abuse, and I particularly want to talk about psychological abuse. I think it's helpful for us to all be aware of what psychological abuse is. So, and this is something that I study in my day job as a domestic violence clinician. And often the folks that we work with don't really recognize they're engaging in psychological abuse or they're experiencing psychological abuse because it's obviously more subtle than physical abuse. However, psychological abuse may have even more damaging impacts than physical abuse in some ways. There's actually been a lot of research on this in the domestic violence area. The psychological abuse has been more strongly linked with PTSD in victims, physical health problems in victims. And the reason for that is the whole purpose of psychological abuse is to affect other people emotionally or psychologically, so it stands to reason that it's going to be impactful. So, you know, we joke about it here, but this is really serious and important, and something for us to be aware of. We want to know when it's happening. We want to know if we're doing any of these things too. So there's different forms of psychological abuse. One form is denigration, and this is kind of direct put downs where you're kind of calling another person a name. You know, and we've heard some names here. Or maybe perhaps like calling you like silly or stupid for your diet, or just calling you names. I mean, especially if you go online, this is something you see, you know, all the time. You know, we see it all the time on our Facebook page. Then there's dominance and intimidation, and I think what you described is an example of dominance and intimidation. So that's where you're trying to sort of intimidate another person or bully another person, you know, through either direct or indirect threats of violence. You know, like I'm going to eat animals, or I'll kill an animal for you, and that sort of thing. Then there's more coercive control, and this is where you're trying to control what other people do. You're trying to control other people. So in the context of domestic violence, this looks like, you know, constantly checking on friends or family members to try to, you know, or trying to tell a partner where they can go or what they could do. In terms of veganism, it might involve kind of trying to force your friends or force your loved ones to eat animals, or to do something else that's inconsistent with your beliefs. And sometimes the abuse can escalate, and you know, I think especially among younger vegans, the abuse may involve bullying. It may even be more severe than that, and it may even escalate to other forms of abuse and even physical violence as well.
Yeah, come on, guys.
I hear a lot of stories about kids in school where the other kids would like show like videos of like animal like torture and cruelty like in their face. Like one would hold them and the other person would make them watch it, or you know, or just tease them with eating meat in front of them and that sort of stuff. And also just kind of social alienation and isolation among like with vegans in school and that sort of stuff. I definitely hear that among younger vegans a lot. Another thing that I think is important to keep in mind, that we as animal advocates may already have trauma history, right? So the abuse may be kind of especially difficult if we already have a history of trauma. You know, many of us have experienced trauma in our own lives. For some of us, we get drawn to animal advocacy because we really feel kind of a connection with the most helpless among us. You know, maybe we've experienced or witnessed unnecessary violence and abuse ourselves, and we've decided we want to help prevent violence and abuse towards others, including like the most defenseless among us. So many of us have experienced trauma. Many of us are constantly exposed to trauma because the more we become aware of the harm we do to animals, the more we see it everywhere, right? So we've all seen like the images on, factory farms and slaughterhouses, all that kind of stuff. So we are exposed to a lot of trauma, and the more aware you are, the more you see it everywhere. Like you can't really watch television without, witnessing harm done to animals. So this can be especially difficult. We already have trauma history, and then we are, experiencing abuse by virtue of being vegan. So just some tips for coping with abuse, if this is something that you're experiencing. First, tell other people about it. I think this is really important that you don't just kind of keep it to yourself. So let other people know, whether it, depending on the context, whether it's like a school administrator or friends, family members, talk to other people about it, process it, ask other people what they think about it, that sort of thing. Seek support from other people. Again, set clear limits with others. So if anybody's being abusive to you, let them know that it's not acceptable, that you're not going to, spend time with them if they're going to continue that. engage in positive self-talk. So when somebody's being abusive to you, just tell yourself that this isn't about me. This is their own issues. This isn't, my fault. This isn't, anything that I'm doing. This is all about them. Their abuse is their own problem. Try not to feed into the abusive pattern. Don't become abusive yourself and just kind of escalate it, because that's not going to help resolve anything. And take good care of yourself. I mean, that's kind of another basic rule of psychology. Self-care is really important, especially, we're experiencing a lot of trauma, we're exposed to a lot of abuse. It's really important that we're all kind of mindful of our own well-being, we're taking care of ourselves, and we are kind of, deciding how much trauma we can kind of bear. For some of us, we have to make a decision, okay, I'm not going to interact with this specific person, or I'm not going to, go to this particular, Facebook page, because I don't really want to expose myself to all this trauma and abuse today. It's not good for me. I'm starting to go to that dark place, and I don't want to go there, right? So taking care of yourself is really important. So let's talk about dating.
So I need some help coping with my non-vegan partner. He tells me that it's great that I care so much about animals, but he told me not to try to force my beliefs on him. He told me today that he's never going vegan, so I shouldn't get my hopes up. I started falling right there. Does anyone have any tips on how to deal with anger towards our partners when they're being narrow-minded and ignorant?
Good job. I love this audience participation. I'm going to do this for all my talk. Is this something any of you have dealt with or are dealing with currently? Mm-hmm. So what do you do? What do you do when your partner's not vegan and they say, "I'm never going to change. Like, leave me the heck alone"? How do you deal with that? Well, yeah. I mean, it's really difficult when this is an important part of your beliefs. This important ethical belief. For me, just like I don't think it's okay to beat our partners, I don't think it's okay to needlessly kill animals. So if you have a partner who doesn't share that belief, that's a really difficult thing to reconcile, I think, and to overcome. Well, I was very fortunate. So my first date with my wife, she ate fish. And we talked about veganism. I was more plant-based than vegan at the time. But that was the last time she ever ate animal flesh. And then it wasn't that long after that where she went vegan and we pretty much went vegan together. And I think if that didn't happen, there's no way we would be together. And I think for me, it tells me kind of the kind of person she was, where she was open to listening and to talking about it. And she didn't shut it out, and she was kind of willing to kind of grow together. And I think that's really important in a potential partner. It would have been really difficult if she just kind of shut it down and was like, I don't want to talk about it, right? Something that's so important to not be able to talk about. Let's go over some tips. The first obvious tip, I think this discussion makes clear, is date a vegan if you can. I think expectations make a big difference. So if you start to date somebody and you're both not vegan, and then one person goes vegan and the other person isn't, that can make it especially challenging because you didn't kind of have that expectation made clear at the beginning. I think it's really important, like I talked about earlier, keep the lines of communication open. I often hear really bad advice when it comes to dating online, where I often see people give the advice saying, don't try to change your partner. Don't, just let him do what he wants, right? I often hear that, and I think that's really terrible advice. I think we should not silence ourselves. We should not decide we're not going to advocate for animals, because again, if our partners were doing harm to other humans, we would never say that. We would never say, oh, just keep quiet that your partner is abusive to other people, right? And so if we wouldn't do that for humans, we shouldn't do it for non-human animals too. And we should be really clear about how we feel, what our ethical beliefs are in a relationship with somebody else. That is stuff we really should be talking about. We should not be silencing ourselves in order to just kind of make nice and and to not rock the boat. Use good timing though. I think this is really an important point. probably playing Earthlings every morning when your partner wakes up is not necessarily going to really work. And I do see that a lot, where I see, you know, I talk to folks who will say, you know, like every day, like, you know, made him watch this movie, I made him read this book, and this and that, and at some point the other person is going to feel like overloaded and feel like that you're just pushing them too far, and they might go in the other direction. So use good timing, find the right time and place to talk about it, but definitely do talk about it. You know, in a way this is a bit of a trick question, because I actually think like being manly is not something that we should all be aspiring to, right? This idea that like we have to be like super like masculine and hyper masculine is really like, it's really like kind of responsible for many of the problems we have in the world. So that's one thing. Like let's get away from this thing that like vegans can be macho assholes too, right? We shouldn't be like kind of promoting that. So this toxic masculinity can promote transphobia, violence against women, and other people. So we need to really be mindful of that. So I don't think manly is necessarily the right term, but I think it's more about strength. And really the question is, you know, are vegans weak or are vegans strong? And I think what you're all saying is that to be vegan is a sign of strength. To stand up for what we believe in, to advocate for others, while we're experiencing, you know, abuse from other people, while we're experiencing all kinds of social isolation and difficulties in our relationships, to advocate for animals in spite of all that is a sign of strength. It doesn't take strength or courage to kill innocent animals, and in fact, it's quite the opposite. And okay, so let's talk about estrogen and soy. We actually have a book about this for vegan publishers called The Skinny on Soy. And we talk about all these myths about soy that are put out by the meat and dairy industries because they like to scare everybody out of consuming soy, so they'll go back to consuming, you know, animal products. Plant estrogen is not the same thing as human estrogen. It has something like it's like 1/1000th of the potency of human estrogen. And in fact, phytoestrogens are actually have been shown to reduce estrogen in the body. So we don't have to worry about the, you know, feminizing effects of soy foods or vegan foods or anything like that. So that's just one of those myths that are out there. But I think that's one of those myths that kind of lead people to kind of say that, you know, vegans are weak or they're somehow, you know, feminine or what have you. Now there's a lot of, when it comes to physical strength, there's a lot of very strong vegans out there. There's all these, you know, amazing vegan athletes who show you can be on a plant-based diet and still be an amazing, strong athlete. So there's actually evidence that vegans do have better sexual performance, perhaps because of increased blood flow from eating a lot of plant-based foods. So there is evidence that vegans do have, you know, better sexual performance. I know it feels a little weird, but I got to, you know, that's what the research says. So yeah, what's wrong with misanthropy? So that is something that I think is important to talk about, you know, especially when we're talking about young vegans, because unfortunately I see a lot of younger vegans will describe themselves as misanthropes, you know, and well, let's illustrate what misanthropy is with this next quote.
I don't care what I say against humans, because the animal holocaust is the worst atrocity this planet has ever seen. Screw humans and their feelings. I only care about animals.
All right, good. Thank you. Okay, that was a little too convincing. So let me ask you all, what is wrong with this? What's wrong with having this misanthropic point of view where you feel like humans are the scourge of the earth and screw all humans, and, you know, I only care about the animals? What's wrong with that? Yeah, people are total. So that's one point. It's not effective in terms of advocacy. When you get to that dark place and you think everybody's terrible, it's going to be a lot harder to reach people and to find something positive to connect with to motivate them. If you think everybody's terrible, you're going to assume the worst about them, and you're not going to find a way to work with them, right? So it's bad on that front. Yeah, so you're disconnected from other people. It's going to be hard to have positive relationships with other people if you just feel like people are terrible. It's violent. Yeah, that's true. It's a violent and aggressive kind of posture to have. Good point. Yeah, you're promoting violence by having that kind of stance, which you would think would run counter to what veganism is about. Right. So it runs against the idea that we're dependent on each other, that we kind of need each other. And I think a lot of times when people first go vegan, they may be more likely to have this point of view, where when you're finding out all the terrible things that we do to animals, it's jarring, and you just want to put an immediate halt to it and kind of shake everybody and like, what's wrong with you? Why are you doing that? But that's not going to be a good way to, that's not, basically I don't think that's the best way to motivate other people to change. I'll give you a good analogy. So I work with domestic violence perpetrators, my day job. I run groups, I do group therapy with people who are abusive to their partners, physically, psychologically abusive. And as deplorable as their behavior is, I'm not going to get them to stop if I get in their face and call them a piece of crap, right? And I think the same thing holds here, that ultimately if we want to help, if we want to end the violence towards others, we have to find a way to kind of connect with people, right? And if we have this misanthropic stance, it's going to be really difficult for us to make that connection and to have them come along with us in changing, right? We have to make that connection. We have to be able to build relationships, and it's hard to build relationships if we're calling everybody terrible. So we talked about some of these problems with taking this stance. Another issue is I think it divides social justice movements. So when we say that we don't care about trauma that humans experience, we are kind of disregarding like a large part of the vegan population. Like we say, I don't care about there's a lot of folks who'll say like, I don't care about racism, I don't care about sexism, all I care about is the animals. Well, you're not really helping us build a movement. You're not bringing people in. You're not helping to create an inclusive movement. And you're also ignoring the fact that issues of social justice are all kind of connected to each other. The view of others as lesser. So by taking this stance that you hate humans, you're kind of, you're perpetuating basically a white vegan movement that doesn't include a lot of other people who we should be including. If we want to build this thing, if we want to really have an impact for animals, we have to grow our numbers. We have to connect with other social justice movements in order to really have an impact. Yeah, so I don't think we want to fall into that stereotype, right? Because there are people who are like that, who say, I don't care about humans, I only care about animals. But I think most of us care about both. And I would say, by and large, vegans work to help end violence towards other humans, probably on a much higher scale than non-vegans do, right? Many of us really work to deal with all kinds of issues, not just veganism. Another thing is there's really no benefit to rank ordering oppression, to say that one is important and others aren't important. There's no function that serves. It doesn't really help anybody. So this is something that we often hear. We'll say, the animal holocaust is the worst of all of them, so I don't care about anything else. Well, how does that make any sense to show that you don't care about other people's oppression or the injustice that other people are experiencing just because it's not on the same scale of what we do to non-human animals? I mean, both are important. Just because there's a smaller number of individuals affected by one or another doesn't make it any more wrong. Right. So she said that some say there's too many human problems to worry about. I'll worry about animals once we've solved world hunger. And then you say, actually, if we promote veganism, that really does help with world hunger, right? Or they say, I'll worry about animals, when we fix the environment, And then we'll say, well, you kind of know, well, that's kind of connected too. And if we have to consider the difference between venting frustration and promoting change. And I think for a lot of folks, they take that more aggressive stance just because they're venting. And without really thinking about what are the implications of that venting. Is it really helping anybody or just making them feel a little bit better? Anger is the easiest emotion to express. So it's easy to be misanthropic. It's easy to say, I hate everybody, right? I mean, that's really the easiest thing we could do. But you know, on the other hand, it's sort of lazy activism, right? I mean, just shouting at people, just kind of calling people names or saying, I hate all humans, really isn't being thoughtful about how you're going to reach people and help them change. It's more important to communicate in ways that are compelling and influential than to be aggressive with other people. Just some other tips with for coping with anger, and I believe this is the last slide. First, and I think this is relevant to some of the conversations we're having here, anger is normal and natural. It's totally normal for us to be angry about what happens to non-human animals. It's perfectly valid. We should be angry because there's a lot of terrible things that we do as a society. So it makes sense to be angry, and anger. So we're not going to take away our anger. We're not going to just stop being angry. That's not really the way anger works. Anger is normal and natural, and we all experience it. It's really what do you do with that anger when you experience it that matters. I think it's important to be aware of our own anger, aware of our triggers. We need to take breaks when we need to kind of cool down before we revisit a conversation. Again, we need to express our feelings underneath the anger. So when we feel anger, there's almost always other feelings that are underneath it. And it's usually those feelings that we really want to express to other people, including our loved ones. So we may get angry at them, but maybe it's because we feel hurt or we feel sad or upset, for whatever reason. So we want to think about what are those feelings underneath the anger that we need to express to them. Lastly, I think it's really important that we try to assume the best in others. And this is, again, a reason why I think it's not healthy and not good for animals to have a misanthropic kind of point of view. Because if we don't assume the best in others, if we assume the worst in others, it's going to be really hard for us to reach them. It's going to be really hard to find that little grain of a possibility that they're going to listen to our vegan message. So we really need to be listening to other people when we communicate with them and try to find any possible in where we can have a discussion with them about veganism or about our use of animals. So it's much more effective to assume the best in people rather than assuming the worst. And that's all I got.
Thank you so much for coming. Good night, everyone. Mahalo.